welcome to Hidden Home Technology. Today we're going to be talking about the Innuos ZEN NG, in particular in comparison to a Grimm MU2. So yeah, here we go. I'm going to start with a whole load of really dry, boring bullet points about what it is and what you can expect when you get it out of the box. So what is the Innuos ZEN NG? Basically, it is a high-end streamer server. It can run on its own software, the Innuos Sense app. It supports Roon. It also handles UPnP, so if you want to use other software or streamers that require UPnP. In general, it is compatible with Tidal, Qobuz, stored files. It's DAC-less. It can have a USB output, a coaxial digital output, or an I2S output. And the USB output can also come in two forms: the one you get out of the box, or the upgraded Phoenix Lite, I believe they call it, USB out, which is effectively reclocked and much less jitter on it, and highly recommended. Right, so features of it in terms of, when you're actually starting to use it, and look at it, I suppose. I think the standout feature for me, or a feature I really need to mention, is the user experience is just friction-free and flawless. So whether that comes to the setup of it initially, choosing whether you want it as a Roon server or whether you want it, to be using Innuos Sense, or whether you want it as an endpoint or, server only. All of those options are just like a tick box, and then you press go and it goes off and does it. It prompts you to enter your Qobuz and Tidal information, and everything else like that. Backups, if you want to back up your music off of it, everything like that is just incredibly simple and just works first time every time. There's no faff or having to, stand on one leg and do it this way, or, it's just brilliant. Can't say enough about that. The build quality, all Innuos products are built nicely, but the ZEN NG casework is unbelievable. It's like kind of billet aluminium everywhere. Weighs a ton. It's great. And the NG, the new generation or next generation, I think it's talking largely about the new motherboard architectures and also the gallium power regulation element of the power supply. I have no idea on earth what that is or what it's getting at. But I can tell you now that if it is the thing that's responsible for the sound quality, it's really good. I'm sure there's more to it. But and in terms of internal storage, it comes in a 2 gigabyte, 4 gigabyte, 8 gigabyte, or 16 gigabyte. No, not gigabytes, terabytes, I should say. So 2, 4, 8, or 16 terabytes. Pricing, again, dull and dry. It's about 9,500 with the 2 terabyte hard drive, going up to about 12,000 with the 16 terabyte hard drive in relatively obvious increments if you divide that difference up. If you want an SP diff output, it's another £600. If you want the Phoenix USB, the reclock USB, it's another £1,000. And if you want the I2S output, again, Phoenix reclocked, it is $1,450 on top of that. So then going on to my experience as the review now, and I will bring Jess in on parts of this as well, but hello, Jess.
Hello.
Basically, I'm going to say it again. It's the flawless UI is the standout feature of the use of the product, because there isn't much else to it. It's a plain black box. You turn it on, you set it up, and that's kind of it. There's zero friction to that process. It's amazing. So going on to how does it sound and, what's it brought to the table in terms of our reference system and my journey in hi-fi. From that regard, to be very clear, because it comes in so many iterations and there's so many variables in this. And as I reviewed it and prepared for this episode, I realized there was just infinite variables almost. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but so many permutations of how you might use it or how it might get implemented that, I think it's very important that I clarify how I was using it. So ultimately, I spent very little time with the standard USB out because I had the Phoenix Reclock board from, it was about day 2. And the second I got it, I was too excited, so I fitted it, and the difference was so remarkable, I never went back. So I haven't got much specifics on it. All I can say is it was loads better. So I think in the 10% extra or whatever it adds to it, I think it's a no-brainer. So I was using the Zen NG with its Phoenix USB out, using a Chord Epic USB into a Mola Tambaki. That was connected in various guises. So there was 2 amplifiers I used it with, the Griffin Diablo 333 and the Macintosh MA12000. So both high-end integrated amps. And speakers on the end of that were the Martin Parker Duo Diamond Edition. So they're about £19,000. And the Dynaudio Heritage Specials, which are about £6,000. How does it sound? So again, this is specifically with the Phoenix Reclock USB, but a lot of it does apply to without that. It's the same, but more so with the USB. It was detailed, unforced, and me and Jess were talking about this detail thing when we're talking about the comparisons with the MU2. It was kind of like, it was like a sort of spotlight detail. So like when you shine a really nice light, I guess a bit like Sam Studio here onto people, the detail levels are just way more present, but there's not really a downside to that. It's not like it's because it's overexposed or something, or contrast enhanced or anything like that. It's just clear and apparent. No harshness with it. The result of that is just there's so much to listen to in the music that wasn't there before. You can kind of listen in, you hear reverb tails, you hear production tricks, you hear like musician skill, the way they're hitting snare drums, you hear the difference between all the different strikes, where the stick lands on the skin, is it at the edge, is it in the middle? You can kind of hear everything like that. It's unbelievable. Yet at the same time, it's also lovely. So it's not analytical or clinical. It's kind of, it's really nice as well. Jess, pipe in at any time here, because I'm going to start going into the MU2 comparison. Not just directly, but in its own right, I've got my notes now from when I was listening to music with it, but the Innuos in comparison, I think, has slightly more like euphoric highs in the sense that there's, it's just like air and grace about it. And so if you've got some sort of dynamic swell in the high frequencies, it can create that sort of sense of euphoria and sort of goosebumps way more. Not way more, that's a huge exaggeration, but noticeably more.
Engulfing, enveloping.
Yeah. I think from that perspective, the MU2 seems to like emphasize ever so slightly lower down in the frequency spectrum. So it's almost like it shifts your focus down into the mid-range. So the sort of tonal color of instruments, slightly more the timbre of drums rather than the detail in the drums. It's more the wood rather than the stick impact or
that was
reverb.
Highlighted when we went back to the MU2 for me. I definitely noticed the detail and what could appear as a brightness when we first installed the MU2 and you still had the Innuos Zenith.
Yes, the Zenith Mark III.
So there was a notable difference when we installed it then.
Yeah.
But then when you went to the NG, another upgrade, it was even more remarkable how much detail and separation there was between all the different audio tracks that we were listening to. Yeah,
I think what Jess was touching on there was when the previous Innuos product that we had in our reference system was the Zenith Mark III, which is about a £5,000 streamer server versus the kind of 10,000 plus for the Zen NG. When we had the Zenith to the Tambaki and we were comparing it to the MU2 was the clear leader. The all of what I was just starting to mention about the kind of tonal color and the kind of stability of the soundstage and things like that, like the sort of three-dimensional tangibility, the kind of it's there in front of you, the palpable thing was greater with the MU2
Yes.
Than it was with the Tambaki with the lesser streamer server on it. But when you go to the Zen NG, somehow, in the previous iteration with the Zenith, the Tambaki was perhaps, I don't know, the negative connotation of bright in comparison. It was that kind of like a bit trebly, a bit splashy.
Sometimes,
yeah,
we're
talking details,
to.
Depending on what you're listening to and generalizations. But it was that kind of higher frequency trebly thing, but not in a good way in comparison to the MU2.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go to the Zen NG, especially with the Phoenix, the reclocked output, the sophistication in those high frequencies comes out.
Yes.
And then they become an absolute joy, and you never want to give them up once you've heard them. It also does have tonal color and all of the things that the MU2 has, but I just think the MU2 is a specialist in that. I think the
MU2 has that ease of listening.
Yes, it does.
Long-term sort of experience about it.
Yeah, definitely. And to use all the kind of stereotypical analogies, it just allows the music to play a bit more and stops you focusing on the hi-fi elements. And the details are there. It's just they're down in a slightly lower frequency element, which makes them less detaily, if that makes sense. They're not the fine details, they're the macro details. It sort of ties the detail into the sound of the instrument, and therefore you have to kind of listen in for it in a sort of strange way. But it also means you don't get it forced on you, which is nice.
Exactly.
It sits back and it's good. So going through my notes to make sure I don't miss anything. There is something I think where with the treble of the MU2, I had people, I think you were one of them, saying that you thought initially the MU2 was kind of brighter, and I was like, I can't hear it at all. But last night, actually, before here, when I was just clarifying these notes, I did hear something. I think it's kind of, there's so much air and softness, extension with the Zen NG in the highs, whereas the MU2 is slightly lower down in the treble region, and that can be a little harder, I think is the word I'd describe. So the cymbals are a little bit harder, less. You don't hear the wobble and shimmer and sustain of the cymbals more. You hear like just a cymbal noise is one thing, and it can create this sort of denser, harder treble.
I suppose with the difference,
but it's so subtle.
Yeah, the NG just had that incredible separation, and that soundscape almost seemed to come into the room a little bit more.
Yes.
And was, again, easy to listen to, but it was, for me, it was more in your face.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is something else to mention about the Grimm as well, in terms of these comparisons. If you use the Grimm as a Roon core, as well as the streamer, or whatever you want to call it, renderer, it's not as good as when the Roon core is off board. So that I find is contradictory to most reviews of it. So I'm wondering whether it's that other reviewers have perhaps used some sort of, in inverted commas, bog standard Roon core, like running Roon on a Mac or something, versus running Roon in a specialist off-board server.
I can definitely
like
support
the
you on
Innuos.
that, though. There was definitely a difference.
Yeah, it came up when we had Darren from Meridian was the first thing. I mean, there's a long story to this, and I'll go over that as well. But effectively, we were playing Jamie XX. I think it's called something like All You Children or something like that. But it's got this kind of big bass line, like a subline. And when it is the Roon core, you lose this kind of, there's like a funny sort of wobble to the bass line. It's like an extra layer of fatness. Maybe it comes in extension or grip and control. But when we were using the Zenith Mark III as the Roon core, playing the same track through the Grimm, suddenly you got this kind of extra layer of bass over, like wrapped round, and it was, more detail. And that was kind of like the one thing you could switch A-B and go, there it is. There's this really obvious
Yes,
benefit.
very clear A-B, yeah.
And then when you sort of just go to the more extended non-A-B listening, I think it's just that I was getting more of those like special hi-fi moments when the Zenith was the core than when the Grimm was the core. And I also, with hindsight there, I did notice that, you know, as you go through these funny phases with hi-fi where you're like in love with your system and then less, you're getting rewards sometimes and not others. I'd noticed that the frequency, I was, you know, basically a bit out of love of the system and I couldn't put my finger on why. And I think it did correspond with when I switched the Roon cores from the Zenith to the Grimm.
Right.
Didn't initially notice any downside, but what I noticed through extended listening was I'd kind of fallen out of love with the system a little bit. You know, wasn't getting that desire to continue listening so much. But again, we are talking subtleties. When I've not had that falling out of love since I've stopped using it as the Roon core. But we are talking a very revealing system. So going back to the Zen NG, because we're focusing on the Grimm here a little bit, the I2S output as well. So I've got the Phoenix board, the I2S Phoenix board, the additional sort of module. I plugged it in, and what I do know is with the little oven controlled clocks, they take a few days to fully burn in and stabilize. They certainly take a few hours before the temperature becomes fully regulated. So initial impressions are sort of misleading when you first put those in, but it again corresponded with the time where I'd plugged in the Diablo 333 for the first time. I'd spent a few days with the Diablo 333, suddenly fell in love with it. When I put the I2S in, I kind of, a bit like I was just describing, I kind of fell out of love a little bit with it. I was struggling to get what I absolutely loved with it. But then I kind of also have to acknowledge that I was using some pretty dodgy HDMI cables in comparison to the USB that I was using. But I also wonder whether the Mola from a design perspective, has more emphasis put on the capability of the USB input than the I2S.
How long did you listen to the I2S port?
Only like a night or two. It wasn't long. So, you know, probably talking a few hours or something like that. I did leave it running overnight.
Sure.
So it sort of gave it some burn-in time for the next night. But because I wanted to go back to focusing on the Diablo 333, I wanted to put it back to the constant that I knew, the USB Phoenix, so that I knew I wasn't having problems with the I2S. So it was just, there were so many variables changing because I had the Martin Parker Duos as a sort of, you know, change, and I'd messed with my system too much, or, you know, the house reference system too much, that I just wanted to go back to something that was a bit more of a constant. So I'll come back to the I2S. But yeah, to sort of clarify, I only had a 2 meter notch up from the very basic called company HDMI. And when you're thinking about the I2S principle of sending the clock down the cable, but on a separate cause, I'm just wondering whether 2 meters of HDMI kind of undoes a little bit of that absolute perfection in the clocking. And you need a short, like a more normal practical length, like a 1 meter cable of a higher standard, to make sure that you preserve that mega clocking.
Yeah.
So if you're talking whatever it is, picoseconds is an issue, whether 2 meters of cable with interference and whatever else that might generate loss was just like not sensible. And so the other alternative I grabbed quickly out of the van was just like what we would use for a HDMI matrix installation. So it's like a fine gauge, flexible HDMI lead in a shorter length. And actually, I think maybe I did prefer that. It was difficult, and I was in this like state of confusion and mild panic because I wanted to get on with the 333. I was hoping just to get an instantaneous wow, whereas it was much more subtle. And so I need to revisit the I2S under controlled conditions.
Sure, it would need another.
Yeah, with a decent cable. Once I know the Diablo 333, then I can give it a fair,
just another diversion,
fair shot. So I2S is there. I also want to speak to Mola and find out whether they actually care about their I2S or whether they just stuck it on there so you could use it.
Yes.
Or not. I know it's
but a lot to be said for the Phoenix
I've done
USB.
that down, by the way. I'm sure Mola would never just stick a connection on the back for the sake of it. But what I mean is, did they put extra special attention on the USB, thinking it'd be the primary way of connecting? Because most people do. So the Zen NG versus the Zenith Mark III. So if you're looking at upgrading, what can you expect? It's really simple. It's just a million times better. A million times being the exact amount. There's more detail, there's more scale, there's more air. I can't think of a descriptor or an element of the sound that wasn't better. Yeah. You know, so everything gets better, and it gets better by a significant margin. Again, to the point where, I thought the MU2 was the be all and end all.
I've never experienced such a notable difference in hi-fi equipment before.
Yeah, for like from source componentry. Yeah, it's mega, isn't it? Yeah, so that in a nutshell is upgrade your Zenith Mark III.
Well worth the investment for sure.
Without even listening, if you're looking for an improvement, that is, because it is an improvement, and I don't see a downside. My next one, so basically, kind of wanted to touch on the complexity of this review with the fact that, you might want to just use the Zen NG as just a server, in which case, by the way it improved the Grimm, it's an amazing server. I think that I can be sure of. So servers matter. I think that was a takeaway from the result. But also streamers do matter as well, like the streaming element of the Zen NG. So when you change the clocking of the output and things like that, that's all kind of illustrating that it's the sum of its parts. It's, a server with a streamer is the sum of its parts. You need both to be really good to get really good.
Yep.
Because using the bog standard USB out, I don't think it would have beaten the Grimm. I really don't. I think I would have still kept the Grimm for its tonal colour, for its ease of listening.
Fair enough.
I think so much improved when I went to the USB, to the Phoenix USB.
Yeah, I do agree.
Considering that there's not that much of a gulf between the Phoenix USB and the Grimm MU2, I think it would have plopped it back down beneath it.
We haven't
not above
really
it.
gone back.
Yeah, I haven't really gone back. Don't want to. It's too good. So there is that element that, I know I'm going to get people saying, oh, well, what about if I've got a Zen NG with this streamer, with that streamer? It's like, well, the server matters. So yes, it's going to get better. Is your streamer better than the standard USB out? Well, it may or may not be. Is it better than the Phoenix USB out? It's going to have to be something serious.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's one of those things where I think all elements of the Zen NG have proved themselves to be like really, really, really good. It does more than you expect it to as well, in the sense that it's UPnP. Basically buy it. But buy the Grimm if you're on a bit more of a, if the budget for a mono Tambaki, because again, that's the context of this review really. And I don't think, it has to be clarified that, we are reviewing it with an offboard DAC, and you can't review it with every offboard DAC. I've tried various different DACs over the past years with the Zenith and things like that, and I know that the Tambaki is epic. So I'm happy with that as a reference.
Big difference, isn't there, budget-wise, with the Tambaki setup and the Innuos NG compared to the MU2?
Yeah, well, this is the thing, because the Grimm is so much more as well.
Exactly,
it's more and more
you
again.
do get a lot more with it.
I would buy the MU2 as a streamer alone, and the fact that it comes with a preamp and a volume control and digital ins and analog throughputs and all the sorts of things that mean you can use it.
Yeah, practically speaking,
in a million different things, and it's tiny. I mean, if I wouldn't bump the mic, I'd pick it up and shake it round. It's a hi-fi in a box, shy of the power amps and speakers. Yeah. So an active pair of speakers in that tiny weeny box is, will floor hi-fi that takes up 10 times the space, even more than that to some extent. So yes, this is like the value proposition of the Grimm is, yes, on paper it's similar money to a Tambaki and a Zen. That's 19,000, 20,000 pounds. That's what, 18,000, 19,000 pounds. But if you're after a decent high-end preamp in this upgrade process, then the Grimm value is mega. We'll talk about the Grimm in another review in depth, but it's unbelievably good. But in a similar context, the Zen NG is loads of things. It's the Roon endpoint, it's the Roon server, it's a UPnP server, has its own software, and another thing, it arguably sounds better if you don't use Roon and use the Innuos Sense app.
True, yeah.
So there is that element for people who aren't Roon. I'm so into Roon, though, that I was saying this to you before, that the added context that Roon brings to the table of, like background on what you're listening to and who the artists are and how it came about, or album reviews as you're reading, as you're listening. It's like a music magazine that you can listen to as you read. It's just unbelievable. And that creates love for the music, that creates engagement with the music. So that benefit of engaging with the music with my heart as well as my brain,
so much more so than the likes of Spotify or Sonos. It's a really nice, clean good-looking modern
Yeah,
user
and
interface.
Innuos ZEN G being the thing in this case, you know, if you're using Innuos ZEN G, you don't get that kind of metadata-y thing of all the
It does
all
have
of the
some good
background.
features to it. You can combine your playlists with your stored music and some of your co-buzz
it's
playlists.
not to belittle
and such,
Innuos ZEN G, it's just the difference in sound quality going to Innuos ZEN G. Yes, that's great. It brings more to the table potentially, arguably. But for me, the engagement with the music when
There's
I
so
have
much more with
Roon
Roon.
adds more to it for me that I'm personally not that bothered. But yeah, it's worth saying that you could possibly make it better again than the Grimm by just using Sense rather than Roon, but Roon might be important. So that's the other thing. So yeah, in conclusion, buy it. But if you haven't got the space or the budget,
there are some very good alternatives.
have an MU2.
Yeah.
And finally, a bit of housekeeping. If you're enjoying the content, please subscribe, please comment, and please like, because it feeds the algorithm and hopefully gets us more than 300 subscribers that we're currently on. So yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you.